Okay, so we're looking at the phylum Nematoda now. This is from lab 37, and we're going to start with the common name for nematodes. They're commonly called roundworms, and they do have some general characteristics. More generally, they're animals, right? So the genus Animalia, and in this particular phylum, these animals, most of them are relatively tiny. We know from our introduction of this lab exercise 37 that also covered flatworms that these are animals that have a pseudocoelom, or a body cavity that's not completely closed in mesoderm. They're bilaterally symmetrical, of course, so they have an anterior and a posterior end, a ventral and dorsal side to them. Some more details regarding this for their feeding ecology. Some are parasitic, and so they live in other animals or on other animals. Some are predatory, and so they go and eat other animals. And many are very tiny, living in things like soil, and they'll basically eat dead organic material. So they're detritivores. So they help break down and recycle nutrients as part of the cycles that go on within ecosystems. As far as reproductive morphology, these do have separate sexes in many species. Some are monoecious, though, or hermaphroditic overall. So they're either dioecious or monoecious. And remember, monoecious is another way of saying hermaphroditic or hermaphrodites. I mentioned earlier their general body plan. They do have a pseudocoelom. They do have an anterior and posterior end. And the anterior end, you have the mouth. The posterior end, you have an anus. So with those two openings, we now have a complete digestive tract. They do have a protective outer flexible coating called a cuticle. This is not the same as the epicuticle we saw in flatworms. These animals, these roundworms, do have an epidermis. This cuticle, though, is tough but flexible, and it does allow for exchange of gases with the environment, even water as well. But this cuticle is resistant, like the epicuticle in flatworms. Different type of structure, though, different origin. But the cuticle is resistant to assaults from digestive enzymes. So within whatever host, any of those specific defenses that the host might have, whether it's in the digestive tract or within the body, any enzymes intended to digest or even kill these parasites, the cuticle protects the animal from that if they are parasites, for example. And many nematodes are important parasites, so we're going to kind of bias this discussion towards parasites rather than free-living ones, but we'll see some free-living ones as well. In some cases, when there are two separate sexes, you may see some dimorphism, and that's down here is actually dimorphic, like in the case of Ascaris, which is rather large for a roundworm. Many roundworms are very, very tiny, requiring magnification to see them. But here the female is the larger one, and the male is the smaller one. And the male also has a hooked end on the posterior end, so you can tell the difference by just examining them if you're looking at full-grown worms here. I skipped this, but there are two morphological advancements that we didn't see in Platyhelminthes, and one of them is the pseudocele, or the false body cavity, and the complete digestive tract. And those are two advancements that we didn't see in in the flatworms. So, as we mentioned earlier, many roundworms are important parasites to animals and humans. One of them causes this elephantiasis here. It's caused by roundworms, filarial roundworms in the genus Filaria. And here the adults lodge in vessels called lymphatic vessels. And lymphatic vessels are part of our circulatory system. We have our cardiovascular system with arteries and veins and so on. But whenever blood makes it to your tissues, some of the fluid escapes into the tissues. Only about 85% comes back into your blood vessels. So the lymphatic vessels are supposed to return the rest of the fluid. So if these filarial worms get lodged in those lymphatic vessels, they can block the return of fluid, and that causes excessive fluid buildup like you see in the foot in this individual who has a filarial worm infection. So, as always, make sure you answer some of the questions associated with each section. In order to save time, I'm not going to invest time there. You can answer those based on running through the lab. Most of the questions can be answered without even looking at actual specimens or doing any dissections. So here's another parasite called Loa loa, and although this worm can migrate within the human body in other places, occasionally it can be found in the eye. And here's an individual. You can see the roundworm there within some of the connective tissue within the white of the eye, and this one is an image taken of someone who's going to have surgery to have it removed. And this is the scientific name for this one is Loa loa. And then here we have some free-living. These are much smaller worms, and what we want to do is, as part of the activity, to look at them. And these, I think, is the genus Rhabditis is the name of them. They're under magnification and they're living, and the idea is to look at them and watch the way they move, because this is significant in the way their muscle is actually laid out. They only have longitudinal muscle that goes along the length of their body, and since muscle shortens, the only thing these worms are capable of doing is wiggling side to side. And that'll be different when we look at roundworms in the next lab. Not roundworms, I'm sorry, segmented worms. They'll have long muscle and circular muscle, and that allows for a different kind of movement. But for now, just think you have muscle fibers or muscle cells that run the length of your body, and they shorten, so this only allows this wiggling motion. So let's check out that motion here in this video. Short little segment. And there you can see that classic side-to-side undulating movement that they do. They're restricted to the kinds of movements they can do within their habitats. So here you want to answer the question, describe how they move and so on, and be much more fun to see these live in the lab, but the video does the job for us for what we need. So now we move on. The larger worms we saw earlier at the beginning of this section here were of the genus Ascaris, and these are worms that are intestinal parasites, and we can find these. There's a species called Ascaris lumbricoides, and they're pretty large. The males are larger than the females, and they're intestinal parasites in both humans and pigs. Humans and pigs have some great similarities between them. And on that study guide, or that, not the study guide, but the quick guide to the lab, I have these same links that you can access that'll show you dissections and diagrams of male and female. This is a male. You can see the hook there at the end and certain structures in there. Of course, the male's going to have some testes and so on. If you took a cross section through the animal there, and we kind of just focused on that cross section there, you can see some of the things that are characteristic. And I'm going to show you an image of a cross section through a male and a female, but it will make more sense when we see the dissection of the animal, at least a diagram of it. Their testes are more like tubular coil structures within there, but you can see there, of course, you're going to have the cuticle on the outside, and then your epidermis, and then you have muscle fibers along the wall there. Muscle comes from mesoderm, so this is mesoderm in origin, and the fibers actually run, or the muscle cells run the length of the body, so when they shorten, they cause the worm to slide back, wiggle back and forth. Then you also have your body cavity here, your pseudocoelom overall, and then here is your intestine, and it's runs the length of the body, and all it really is just endoderm. There's no other tissues, no mesoderm or ectoderm tissues there, and this is the inside of it there. And then you can see some of the structures there, including the testes that are highlighted there. So we're going to actually take a look at what this really looks like in a cross-section through both a male and a female, but it would help if we looked at how those organs are laid out inside the body. And so if we were to do the dissection, you'd have both your male and your female. I have a diagram right here, and if you search the web, you can probably find some images of real dissected worms, and they're big enough for you to dissect in terms of size. They may get up to maybe females can get up to probably 30 centimeters easy in length. And you can see here, if we went in and opened up and got into the body cavity, you have a pore here that comes to the outside, and that's one of those things that you look for before you start dissecting these pores here, including the genital pore. And you can see from the mouth, this yellow structure is your intestine that runs the length of the body. And there's your genital pore, the vagina, and then the uterus splits into two, okay, overall, and the uterus is continuous with another coil tube, or the ovary. Okay, so the ovary and the oviduct. So your ovary and then your oviduct, which transports the eggs into the uterus, and then when sperm is transferred by the male in here, the sperm can fertilize the eggs, and then the eggs would be released. A lot of them, like typical of parasites, you're going to produce a lot of eggs because it's hard to find a host. We're seeing that same theme when it comes to parasites, right? And this, when we see the cross section here, it'll make more sense. And then this is your male. Male would be smaller. They drew it the same size as the female, but it's usually smaller, a little bit more difficult to dissect. And here you can see the hooked end here on the posterior side. This would be the anterior end of the animal there. And they have some various structures, but if you were to section through there, you can see that the testes themselves and a tube called the vas deferens transports the sperm to some of the final structures before it exits the male and enters the female seminal vesicle here. So if we were to section through here, it would make sense why you see several structures that are labeled testes there. And then you also see, again, here's the intestine that runs the length of the body. So now let's compare this, how it looks in cross-section. The one on the left is the male. Okay, so here's your male section here. And they do have nervous nerve organs here. So here you have your ventral nerve cord right here and your dorsal nerve cord. Here's your muscle along the inside of the walls there. Okay, and then number two, here's your testes, and then you have another section through it. Remember the testes, if we were to section through there, you're going to get sections through several of the testes there. And then here's a flattened out intestine, and the inside, that space within there, there's the inside of the intestine, or the lumen of the intestine. And if we were to point right there in that fluid-filled space, that's your pseudocoelom. There's other structures in there, including the vas deferens, so it's probably vas deferens and others, but just stick to the things that are identified here in this image. And then if we were to section through the female, right here, just like that, you're going to get two portions of the uterus because it's forked, right? So again, here's your intestine. It seems to be flattened up a bit, and the lumen of the intestine, which is the space in there. And these large structures right here, those are your two sections of the uterus there. So then you got your ovaries there, number 7 on here. So here's your ovary, how it coils back and forth. If we go into the body cavity, that's your pseudocoelom. And then again, you have your muscle on the walls, and you have your dorsal and your ventral nerve cords. Here, of course, you have your cuticle and epidermis on the outside. That again is the muscle that runs the length of it. So the cross sections really do make much more sense when we look at what the dissection would look like and sectioning through that. So one key thing to remember here is pseudocoelom complete digestive tract or system here. We have mouth and anus, and then just some slight differences between the male and the female internal anatomy. And understanding that from the diagram on the left helps us understand these cross sections through these real specimens, pictures that were taken of specimens. So that was Ascaris. Now we have Trichinella, and Trichinella and Enterobius are important parasites of animals and humans. And for Trichinella, you can see the larva, which is encysted in a skeletal muscle. And this you can get a disease called trichinosis, named after the genus. And if you eat undercooked, say you ate the flesh of a pig that was infected by and had these larvae encysted in there, and you ate the flesh and it was not cooked well. Now, this doesn't tend to be a problem in our food supply, but let's say you're eating a wild animal that you're hunting and you didn't cook it well and you didn't kill the larvae. You can get these into your system, and then they can migrate to muscles like the diaphragm or your tongue. And they call this kind of muscle strident. And I seem to recall that although your lab doesn't mention this, it may be even the heart muscle. And so this can cause problems with correct functioning of those muscles. So again, the name of the disease is trichinosis. So that's Trichinella. Enterobius is talked about on the next slide there. So Enterobius vermicularis specifically, this one is found in the rectum of the digestive system, and typically picked up by kids who don't wash their hands well. The eggs are everywhere. I was once told that they were everywhere in the environment. So let's say you're outside or wherever, and you've just been handling things outside, dirt, whatever, and you get some in your fingernails, and then you go and you eat a sandwich, and then you ingest it, and kids are pretty good at doing that stuff. And so the adults live in the rectum, and then at night they come out, and this is where they get their common name, pinworms. When they do come out into the perianal area there, the area surrounding the anus, they create a very significant itching sensation. So the child who has this intestinal parasite often gets very itchy. Oftentimes this is at night when they're trying to go to bed. So treatment for that would be a medication that would kill these. And there you can see on the right, upper right, you can see they're pretty small animals, and they do come out. So this is the cycle, the external environment. The eggs are picked up from the environment. This is there on the bottom. So the egg with the embryo gets ingested, hatches. Then it goes into the mucosa of the intestine, pretty much there in the rectum. And then again, the females will come out to the perianal region, which creates a big itchy sensation. And then they deposit their eggs so that they get out in the environment again. So that's the life cycle there is an important parasite, especially when it comes to children. Again, a lot of roundworms, probably the majority of them are free living and beneficial in the environment. There's another one that's significant here, and there's images that you can look at called Necator. These are hookworms, and oftentimes they can create some bleeding within the stool because these are intestinal roundworm parasites. And oftentimes, if you ever take your dog or cat to the vet, they deworm or they're deworming for these types of parasites that are in there. And then another one that's significant is, and if we picked on the image for Necator, you would, what are we looking at, right? Here's Dirofilaria though, and let's see if we can get that image to come up here. And if you can tell what that organ is, that's right there. That's a heart right there, and these are the worms in there. These are the heartworms that are transmitted by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes transmit the larvae. They bite your dog or your cat. As far as I know, I asked the vet one time, said that, I said, we get bitten by mosquitoes all the time. How come we don't get them? Well, these are just not parasite. They're a little bit host specific. So fortunately, we don't get the adult worms developing within our bodies. So that's a good thing. And the life cycle, there's another image for them, and this is an image from the Center for Disease Control. And there you can see the animals. So you see those same mosquitoes can bite us, right? But the adult worms only develop within the pulmonary circulation. That's the circulation going towards the lungs. And so over time, that creates problems, and ultimately leads to their death. So that's why they recommend giving them these anti-worm drugs that are heartworm medication to prevent that.